In the year 738 of the Common Era, beneath a blazing sun that scorched the limestone plazas of Piedras Negras, a captive warrior from the rival city of Pomoná knelt before the carved throne of Ach II, wrists bound with henequen fiber. His body painted black, the color of death. The prisoner understood that sunrise had delivered him not to ransom or slavery, but to the sacred knife. This was not murder. This was cosmology made flesh, a transaction between the mortal and divine realms, where blood became currency and suffering ensured the universe itself would continue turning. For the Maya, violence was not merely political or punitive. It was liturgical, woven into the fabric of existence as tightly as the warp and weft of their finest textiles. The Maya civilization, which flourished across present-day southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, from approximately 2000 BCE until the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, constructed one of the most sophisticated cultures in pre-Columbian America. They developed advanced hieroglyphic writing, precise astronomical calculations, monumental architecture, and complex political networks. Yet beneath the grandeur of their stepped pyramids and the elegance of their mathematical achievements lay a religious worldview that demanded regular, ritualized violence. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create humanity. Humanity must reciprocate in blood to sustain the cosmos. This theological architecture transformed warfare, kingship, and even the human body itself into instruments of sacred obligation. The rituals were neither random nor gratuitous. They followed celestial calendars, marking solstices, Venus cycles, and the completion of sacred time periods called kaiatones. According to archaeological evidence documented by a pegafer, David Stewart in his comprehensive studies of Maya hieroglyphic texts, these ceremonies were meticulously choreographed performances with specific roles, costumes, and sequences designed to reenact mythological events. The King Kalaja, or Divine Lord, stood at the center of this cosmic theater, simultaneously priest, warlord, and living conduit between earth and the heavens. Blood was the essential offering. Maya believed it contained shulel, the spiritual essence that animated all living things. When spilled in ritual context, this life force nourished the gods, particularly the sun god, Ach, who required sustenance for his nightly journey through Xibalba, the treacherous underworld. Without regular transfusions of shulel, the sun might fail to rise, crops would wither, and the carefully maintained order separating civilization from chaos would collapse. From this perspective, the captive kneeling at Piedras Negras was not a victim, but a necessary sacrifice, his death a bulwark against cosmic entropy. The violence took many forms. Auto-sacrifice, in which rulers pierced their own tongues' earlobes, or genitals with stingray spines or obsidian blades, demonstrated royal piety and endurance. The blood collected on bark paper was then burned, the smoke rising as sustenance for divine beings. More dramatically, captured warriors from rival cities underwent decapitation, heart extraction, or elaborate tortures designed to prolong suffering and maximize the spiritual potency of their deaths. Archaeological excavations at sites like Calakmul and Tikal have uncovered mass graves, carved monuments depicting bound captives, and ceremonial caches containing human remains bearing unmistakable evidence of ritual killing. These practices were not secrets whispered in shadows. They were public spectacles performed atop towering pyramids before assembled populations. The architecture itself steep staircases forcing captives to climb toward their deaths, while thousands watched from below transformed execution into theater. Blood-stained steps became stages where political power, religious devotion, and cosmological necessity converged. For the ruler orchestrating these ceremonies, successful rituals validated divine favor and political legitimacy. For the populace, witnessing these rites affirmed their place in a universe maintained through sacred violence. And for the captive, there existed perhaps only the cold knowledge that his death would be remembered, carved into stone, his name and city forever bound to his captor's glory. The captive from Pomoná had not always been destined for the sacrificial stone. Weeks earlier, he had been a warrior of standing, possibly even nobility, trained from childhood in the arts of combat that defined Maya masculinity. Young boys in Maya city-states began military education early, learning to wield obsidian-edged clubs called makuaweedle, to throw spears with otlot launchers, and to move through dense jungle terrain with lethal efficiency. Warfare was not merely about territorial expansion or resource extraction, though these certainly mattered. It was fundamentally about capturing enemies alive. A warrior who killed in battle gained honor, but one who seized prisoners for ritual sacrifice gained glory eternal, his deeds recorded in hieroglyphic inscriptions that would outlast his flesh by centuries. The conflict between Piedras Negras and Pomoná reflected the complex geopolitical landscape of the classic Maya period. From approximately 250 to 900 Common Era, the Maya world was never unified under a single empire. Instead, dozens of independent city-states competed for resources, prestige, and tributary relationships. Major powers like Tikal and Calakmul commanded networks of vassal cities, while smaller polities navigated precarious alliances, shifting loyalties based on military strength, royal marriages, and the charisma of individual rulers. War was constant but rarely aimed at annihilation. The goal was to humiliate rival dynasties, capture their kings or high-ranking nobles, and through their ritual sacrifice, demonstrate supernatural favor and political dominance. The warrior from Pomoná had likely participated in his own city's ceremonies, had perhaps witnessed captives from Piedras Negras meet their ends atop Pomoná's pyramids. The cyclical nature of Maya warfare meant that today's sacrificer could become tomorrow's sacrifice, a grim reciprocity that every warrior understood. When the forces of Kyanich, Yonalak II, descended upon Pomoná's territory, perhaps as retaliation for an earlier raid, perhaps to celebrate the completion of a Kayatan time period, the Pomoná warrior fought with the desperation of a man who knew capture meant not merely death, but ritualized obliteration designed to feed the cosmos itself. The battle would have been brutal and intimate. Maya combat favored close quarters, with warriors protected by thick cotton armor and wooden shields, wielding clubs embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades capable of decapitating a man with a single stroke. Yet, killing was often avoided when capture was possible. Warriors worked in coordinated groups using nets, ropes, and overwhelming numbers to subdue valuable prisoners. For the Pomoná warrior, the moment of capture was the moment his identity fundamentally shifted from honored defender of his city to sacrificial offering for his enemies' gods. The journey from battlefield to sacrificial altar could take weeks. Captives were often displayed in subsidiary settlements, paraded through enemy territory as living trophies. Archaeological evidence, including murals at sites like Bonampak, depicts these processions in vivid detail. Bound prisoners, some already mutilated, forced to witness the power of their captors while populations jeered and celebrated. For the prisoner, this period was one of psychological torture, anticipating an end both inevitable and horrifying. Some captives were kept for years, awaiting the most auspicious calendrical moment for their sacrifice. Others, like the Pomoná warrior, faced their fate within weeks or months of capture. The ritual preparations transformed the captive into something between human and offering. His body was painted, adorned with specific regalia, marking his status as destined for the gods. He was given ritual foods, substances that might alter consciousness or simply sustain him for the ordeal ahead. In some accounts, preserved in hieroglyphic texts and later Spanish colonial sources, captives were subjected to preliminary tortures, finger removal, genital mutilation, or systematic beatings, not from sadism, but as ritual purification, a gradual separation of the sacred from the profane. By the time the Pomoná warrior ascended the pyramid steps at Piedras Negras, he was no longer merely a man. He had become a vessel for cosmic exchange. His impending death, a necessary violence that would, in Maya cosmology, preserve the world itself from dissolution. The plaza at Piedras Negras thronged with witnesses as the Pomoná warrior was led up the steep pyramid steps. The structure itself, rising over 100 feet above the surrounding jungle canopy, was a symbolic mountaineer recreation of the sacred peaks where gods and ancestors dwelled. Each ascending step brought the captive closer to the celestial realm, further from the mortal world he would never rejoin. At the summit, Kyanich Yonalak II waited in full ceremonial regalia: jade collar, quetzal feather, headdress, jaguar pelt mantle, and facial ornaments that transformed his features into a living representation of divine authority. Beside him stood the henequen, the ceremonial priests, who would perform the physical acts of sacrifice while the king served as the ritual's spiritual anchor. The timing of this ceremony was precise. Maya astronomical observations, among the most accurate in the pre-modern world, dictated that certain rituals coincide with celestial phenomena. A sacrifice might mark the heliacal rising of Venus, that brilliant morning star associated with warfare and transformation, or coincide with the completion of a 360-day period in the Maya calendar. These moments were perceived as dangerous transitions when the boundaries between cosmic realms grew thin, requiring blood offerings to stabilize the universe. The Pomoná warrior's death was thus scheduled not at his captor's whim, but according to calculations preserved in bark paper codices and architectural alignments that tracked solar and planetary movements with extraordinary precision. The actual method of sacrifice varied by occasion and victim status. High-ranking captives, particularly enemy rulers or their close relatives, typically underwent heart extraction, the most prestigious and spiritually potent form of ritual killing. The victim was forced backward over a curved stone, stretching the chest cavity. The aged Kohen wielded an obsidian blade, its edge sharper than modern surgical steel, to open the rib cage with practiced efficiency. The still-beating heart was extracted, held aloft for the crowd to witness, and then either burned, placed in a ceremonial vessel, or, in some accounts, consumed by the king himself in an act of ritual cannibalism that transferred the victim's shulel directly to the consumer. Archaeological evidence supports the historical reality of these practices, despite their horror. Excavations at Copan Yaxchilon and other major Maya centers have uncovered human remains showing clear signs of perimortem trauma, consistent with heart extraction. Carved stelae and lintels depict the ritual in explicit detail, with hieroglyphic captions identifying the victims by name and city of origin. At Piedras Negras specifically, multiple monuments commissioned by Knelt Act II record his capture and sacrifice of warriors from neighboring polities, transforming these violent acts into permanent records of divine favor and political triumph. For the Pomoná warrior, consciousness, during heart extraction, would have lasted only seconds, long enough to experience catastrophic pain, short enough to prevent prolonged suffering. But the ritual did not end with death. The body itself became a sacred object requiring specific treatment. In some ceremonies, the corpse was decapitated. The head displayed on a tampatlia skull rack that stood in the plaza as a permanent reminder of the king's martial prowess. The remaining body might be dismembered, with bones cleaned and incorporated into ritual caches buried beneath temples or monuments. Blood that spilled onto the pyramid summit was absorbed by the stone itself, sanctifying the architecture and creating what archaeologists call ensouled buildings, structures literally fed by human sacrifice. The psychological impact on witnesses cannot be understated. For the assembled population of Piedras Negras, the ceremony was simultaneously terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying because it demonstrated the king's absolute power over life and death, his willingness to orchestrate spectacular violence in service of divine obligation. It's reassuring because it confirmed that the proper rituals were being performed, that the gods were being fed, that cosmic order was being maintained. Children growing up in Maya cities learned early that the universe demanded blood, that their king stood between them and chaos, that death in ritual context was not merely inevitable, but necessary for collective survival. The sacrifice of the Pomoná warrior served purposes beyond theological necessity. Knelt Act II, like all Maya rulers, governed through a complex blend of religious authority, military prowess, and political theater. The public execution of high-status captives was perhaps the most powerful propaganda tool, available to a divine lord seeking to cement his legitimacy and intimidate rivals. Each successful campaign culminating in sacrifice reinforced the ruler's claim to supernatural favor, proof that the gods had blessed his reign, that his bloodline retained the cosmic mandate to rule. Conversely, a king unable to secure captives for ritual killing faced dangerous questions about his efficacy as divine intermediary. The competition among Maya city-states created a relentless demand for sacrificial victims. This demand, in turn, fueled a militaristic culture where warfare was not seasonal or exceptional but endemic. According to research by archaeologist Arthur Demarest, who has extensively studied Maya warfare and political systems, the classic period witnessed an escalating cycle of conflict as cities competed not just for territory, but for the prestige that came from capturing and sacrificing enemy nobility. This dynamic created feedback loops, where successful sacrifice rituals enhanced a ruler's reputation, attracting allies and warriors, enabling more ambitious campaigns, which produced more captives, which enabled more elaborate rituals, a spiral that peaked in the 8th and 9th centuries before the classic Maya collapse. Piedras Negras itself exemplifies this pattern. It's located strategically along the Usumacinta River in present-day Guatemala. The city controlled vital trade routes and maintained complex relationships with both the great power, Xcasilan, to the south, and various smaller polities. The dynasty of Kainich Yonel Ake II had to continually demonstrate strength to maintain its position in this competitive environment. The ruler's monuments, particularly Stele 12 and 14, record multiple successful campaigns against neighboring cities, with hieroglyphic texts explicitly naming captured warriors and describing their ritual deaths. These inscriptions served as permanent billboards of royal power, readable by literate elites who visited the city and visually impressive to illiterate populations who could nevertheless understand the iconography of bound captives and triumphant kings. Yet the system contained inherent instabilities. The requirement for constant warfare to supply sacrificial victims created perpetual conflict that drained resources, disrupted agriculture, and prevented the consolidation of larger political units. Cities that overextended militarily or suffered significant defeats faced, it's not just political humiliation, but theological crisis. If a ruler could not protect his people or provide the gods with proper offerings, his claim to divine authority collapsed. This vulnerability meant that the same rituals designed to demonstrate strength could, if circumstances shifted, become evidence of weakness. The captives themselves came from all levels of Maya society, though high-status prisoners were most prized. Common warriors might be sacrificed in groups during major ceremonies, while captured kings or their close relatives received individualized treatment. Their deaths commemorated in detailed hieroglyphic narratives. The social implications were profound. Knowing that capture meant not merely death, but ritualized obliteration designed to erase one's identity, while glorifying one's captor, created powerful incentives. Warriors fought desperately to avoid capture, sometimes choosing death in battle over the certainty of sacrifice. Conversely, the possibility of capturing an enemy king and orchestrating his spectacular execution drove military strategy and tactics. The families of sacrificial victims endured their own agonies. Maya society placed enormous value on lineage and ancestry, maintaining detailed genealogies that connected living rulers to mythological founders. When a high-status warrior was captured and sacrificed by enemies, his entire lineage was humiliated. His city's gods appeared weaker than his captor's deities. His descendants carried the shame of his ritualized death, often depicted in enemy monuments that would survive for centuries. This familial dimension added layers of suffering beyond the physical act of sacrifice itself, creating intergenerational trauma encoded in stone and collective memory. By the beginning of the 10th century, the elaborate machinery of Maya ritual sacrifice had ground to a halt across much of the central lowlands. The classic Maya collapse, a demographic, political, cultural catastrophe that saw populations plummet and cities abandoned, remains one of archaeology's most studied mysteries. While no single factor explains this transformation, the system of ritualized violence that had sustained Maya civilization for centuries may have contributed to its undoing. The endemic warfare required to supply sacrificial victims had created a landscape of perpetual conflict. Cities fortified their centers, agricultural lands became battlegrounds, and the elaborate trade networks that had carried obsidian, jade, and cacao across hundreds of miles fractured under the strain of constant raiding. Climate change compounded these pressures. Paleoclimatic studies of lake sediments and cave formations indicate that the 9th century experienced severe droughts across the Maya lowlands. Crop failures would have undermined the agricultural surplus required to support both large urban populations and the non-productive warrior and priestly classes who orchestrated the sacrificial system. A king who could not feed his people yet still demanded captives for increasingly elaborate rituals faced a legitimacy crisis. Archaeological evidence from sites like Pomoná shows that monumental construction, including the carved stele that commemorated sacrifices, abruptly ceased, suggesting that the resources and political will to maintain these traditions simply evaporated. The human cost of the sacrificial complex remains incalculable, but was certainly immense. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of individuals across the centuries-long span of classic Maya civilization met deaths. Designed to be spectacular, painful, and public, behind each carved glyph naming a captive warrior lay a person with family, history, aspirations, all terminated in service of cosmological beliefs that modern observers can study, but perhaps never fully comprehend. The Maya themselves understood this tragedy, embedding in their mythology stories of divine sacrifice that created the world. The gods had bled to make humanity. Humanity bled to sustain creation. From within this worldview, the suffering was terrible but meaningful. Violence transformed into sacred exchange. The Spanish conquest in the 16th century brought new layers of violence and reinterpretation. Catholic priests, horrified by the blood rituals they witnessed among the Maya descendants, particularly in the northern Yucatan, where ceremonial traditions persisted, condemned these practices as demonic. Diego de Landa, the Franciscan bishop who both documented Maya culture and systematically destroyed their codices, wrote detailed descriptions of sacrifice rituals while orchestrating his own religious violence through forced conversions and punishment of idolatry. The colonial narrative of Maya savagery served to justify conquest and cultural obliteration, obscuring the sophisticated cosmological reasoning that had motivated the rituals. Modern archaeology has worked to recover a more nuanced understanding. Researchers recognize that while Maya sacrifice was undeniably violent, it operated within specific cultural logic, rather than simple barbarism. The Maya created one of the world's great civilizations, made achievements in mathematics, astronomy, and art that remain impressive millennia later, all while maintaining religious practices that demanded regular human blood. This juxtaposition challenges simplistic narratives about progress and savagery, forcing recognition that brilliance and brutality can coexist within the same cultural matrix. The legacy of Maya sacrifice extends beyond academic study. Its contemporary Maya communities, numbering millions across Central America, maintain complex relationships with their ancestors' practices. Many preserve ritual traditions stripped of human sacrifice but retaining elements of blood offering and cosmic reciprocity. Others reject these aspects entirely, embracing Christianity or syncretic traditions that blend indigenous and Catholic elements. The archaeological sites themselves, Piedras Negras, Tikal, Palenque, Chichen Itza, have become tourist destinations where visitors photograph pyramids without fully grasping that these stones were deliberately bloodied, that the magnificent art they admire often depicts ritualized killing in explicit detail. The grim rituals of the Maya ultimately pose uncomfortable questions about the human capacity for violence when sanctioned by religious belief and political necessity. They remind us that atrocity and sophistication are not opposites, that cultures can achieve remarkable intellectual heights while committing systematic cruelty in service of ideas they hold sacred.